Where were you when Tasmania was first setting sail for where it calls home today? Tasmania said goodbye to India 3 million years ago. Scientists say people crossed into Tasmania 40,000 years ago by way of a land bridge from Australia. How did they get to Australia? In the last glacial period, sea level rose, flooding the Bashan Plain, isolating its passengers on Tasmania for 11,000 years. That's until the unfortunate day they were discovered by Europeans. If walls could talk, we'd have to be listening.
Tasmania's original human inhabitants. It's been well documented what became of Tasmania's Aboriginal people, but what is not known is where they originally came from. DNA is DNA is DNA, whether it comes from humans, animals, plants, or fungi. When we look at the DNA of animals like Pochi the thylacine, we focus on the DNA that makes the thylacine and not particularly Pochi's DNA or his relationship with his parents or siblings. Our view of human DNA is generally to determine one human's relationship to another, a la Jerry Springer. The Human Genome Project produced a reference human genome sequence that scientists now regularly use to compare with newly generated genome sequences. This reveals genomic changes that have occurred in different populations over time, which provides a more powerful way to decipher the various stories of human origins and ancestry.
Ancient DNA tells our species' history. Nearly 20 years ago, scientists developed techniques for extracting small amounts of DNA from ancient samples, like bones or fur or even soil, using sensitive methods to sequence the extracted DNA. Genomic studies like these have allowed humans to examine their genomes from around 400,000 years ago, when Homo sapiens were diverging from other similar species, such as Homo neanderthalensis or Neanderthals. We've learned that Neanderthals took a different path than humans in their migrations around the world, but there are still traces of Neanderthal DNA sequences in our genomes today. These small stretches of DNA may influence traits that have helped people survive in some way, making it more likely to then be passed on to their children. Where is the ancient DNA from Australia? If we can find bones over 40,000 years, we might know where they came from before arriving in Tasmania. Is Lucy everybody's mother? Perhaps the world's most famous early human ancestor, the 3.2 million-year-old ape Lucy, was the first Australopithecus afarensis skeleton ever found, though her remains are only about 40% complete. One of the earliest known humans is Homo habilis, or handyman, who lived about 2.4 million to 1.4 million years ago in eastern and southern Africa. Others include Homo rudolfensis, who lived in eastern Africa about 1.9 million to 1.8 million years ago, and Homo erectus, the upright man, who ranged from southern Africa all the way to modern-day China and Indonesia from about 1.89 million to 110,000 years ago. In addition to these early humans, researchers have found evidence of an unknown superarchaic group that separated from other humans in Africa around 2 million years ago. These superarchaic humans mated with the ancestors of Neanderthals and Denisovans, according to a paper published in Science Advances in February 2020. Scientists are still figuring out when all this intergroup mating took place. Modern humans may have mated with Neanderthals after migrating out of Africa and into Europe and Asia around 70,000 years ago. What was happening in Australia? Less is known about the Denisovans and their movements, but research suggests modern humans mated with them in Asia and Australia between 50,000 and 15,000 years ago. DNA is only good for about 400,000 years at the moment. Due to the chemical degradation of DNA over time, the oldest human DNA retrieved so far is dated at no more than approximately 400,000 years, says Enrico Capellini, associate professor at the Globe Institute, University of Copenhagen. One of the earliest known humans that lived was Homo habilis, or handyman, was old enough to have hitched a ride on Pangea while it was breaking up. Could they have hitched a ride on Australia? If they left their DNA, we won't be able to determine that just yet. Science needs time to figure out how. It was assumed people of African descent didn't have Neanderthal ancestry because their predecessors didn't leave Africa to meet the Neanderthals in Europe and Asia. But in January 2020, a paper in Cell appended that narrative by reporting that modern populations across Africa also carry a significant amount of Neanderthal DNA. Could modern humans be migrating back into Africa over the past 20,000 years after mating with Neanderthals in Europe and Asia? Although the majority of modern humans' DNA still comes from a group that developed in Africa, Neanderthal and Denisovan's DNA accounts for only a small percentage of our genes. New discoveries about intergroup mating have complicated our view of human evolution. It seems like the more DNA evidence that is acquired, the more questions come to light. Denisovan's mated with Neanderthals in Siberia for around 100,000 years. The most direct evidence of this is the recent discovery of a 13-year-old girl who lived in a cave about 90,000 years ago. DNA analysis revealed that her mother was a Neanderthal, and her father a Denisovan. What is genetic ancestry testing? Genetic ancestry testing, or genetic genealogy, is a way for people interested in family history to go beyond what they can learn from relatives or from historical documentation. Examination of DNA variations can provide clues about where a person's ancestors might have come from and about relationships between families. Certain patterns of genetic variation are often shared among people of particular backgrounds. The more closely related two individuals, families, or populations are, the more patterns of variation they typically share. 3 types of genetic ancestry testing are commonly used for genealogy. Y chromosome testing. Variations in the Y chromosome, passed exclusively from father to son, can be used to explore ancestry in the direct male line. Y chromosome testing can only be done on males, because females do not have Y chromosomes. Mitochondrial DNA testing. This type of testing identifies genetic variations in mitochondrial DNA. Although most DNA is packaged in chromosomes within the cell nucleus, cell structures called mitochondria also have a small amount of their own DNA, known as mitochondrial DNA. Both males and females have mitochondrial DNA, which is passed on from their mothers, so this type of testing can be used by either sex. It provides information about the direct female ancestral line. Single nucleotide polymorphism testing. These tests evaluate large numbers of variations, single nucleotide polymorphisms or SNPs, across a person's entire genome. The results are compared with those of others who have taken the tests to provide an estimate of a person's ethnic background. Genealogists use this type of test because Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA test results, which represent only single ancestral lines, do not capture the overall ethnic background of an individual. Pangea. Pangea was a supercontinent that existed during the late Paleozoic and early Mesozoic eras. It assembled from the earlier continental units of Gondwanan, Euramerica, and Siberia during the Carboniferous approximately 335 million years ago, and began to break apart about 175 million years ago, at the end of the Triassic and beginning of the Jurassic. That's where the story gets interesting for Tasmania. In contrast to the present Earth and its distribution of continental mass, Pangea was centred on the equator and surrounded by the superocean Panthalassa and the Paleotethys and subsequent Tethys oceans. Pangea is the most recent supercontinent to have existed and the first to be reconstructed by geologists. But all its pieces were on the move. India was looking for its new home just as Australia was. It sailed to its new home with Tasmania attached as a peninsula. How do the smart people know that? The geography of the continents bordering the Atlantic Ocean was the first evidence suggesting the existence of Pangea. The seemingly close fit of the coastlines of North and South America with Europe and Africa was remarked on almost as soon as these coasts were charted. Additional evidence for Pangea is found in the geology of adjacent continents, including matching geological trends between the eastern coast of South America and the western coast of Africa. The polar ice cap of the Carboniferous period covered the southern end of Pangea. Glacial deposits, specifically till, of the same age and structure are found on many separate continents that would have been together in the continent of Pangea. Fossil evidence for Pangea includes the presence of similar and identical species on continents that are now great distances apart. Imagine that.
Ask yourself, at this point in the evolution of humans, was anyone on board?
Scientists say no.
Australian DNA in India. A new study of indigenous Australian DNA suggests there was some form of migration from India to Australia about 4,000 years ago. Aboriginal people first inhabited Australia about 40,000 years ago, and researchers had previously thought them to be isolated from the rest of the world for thousands of years. So, what's going on? Professor Alan Cooper, from the University of Adelaide Centre for Ancient DNA, says the Indian influence may well have played a role in the development of the Aboriginal culture. He says it is impossible to ignore the link with the discovery of the dingo. The timing of all those things in the archaeological record, about 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, happens to match the timing estimated for this genetic influx from India, he said. The timing is similar enough that it's now got us wondering whether the two are connected. The timing is suggestive. Professor Cooper also points to a big expansion of one of the Aboriginal language groups.
Current scientific belief. First arriving in Tasmania around 40,000 years ago, the Aboriginal Tasmanians were cut off from the Australian mainland by rising sea levels circa 9000 BC. They were entirely isolated from the rest of humans for 11,000 years until European contact. High sea levels were common around the world at the end of the last ice advance around 9000 BC. And if we look today for dwellings of man that existed then, like Dvarka, the home of Krishna, then we must look 100 meters below current sea levels. These are the days of the Mahabharata in Indian mythology, when millions of people inhabited this part of the world, whether you believe they were gods or just early human beings.
Dr. Mark Stoneking, of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, says it's taken a while for the Indian influence to be discovered because indigenous Australians have been hesitant to participate in these kinds of genetic studies. Based on their previous treatment at the hands of Europeans, the Australian groups have been rather suspicious of what the purpose of these studies were and what they might reveal, he said.
Migration chronology. Scientists say Tasmania was colonized by successive waves of Aboriginal people from Australia during the last glacial maxima. Anytime the poles have ice, it's technically an ice age, but even during an ice age, the glaciers advance and retreat. This in turn causes sea levels to rise 200 to 400 feet. How do scientists know they came in waves? The archaeological record suggests a period of drying, with the colder glacial period creating a desert extending from southern Australia into the Midlands of Tasmania. People migrating from southern Australia into peninsular Tasmania would have crossed stretches of seawater and desert, and finally found oases in the King Highlands, now King Island. Colonial settlers, 1800, found two main language groups in Tasmania upon their arrival, which correlates with the broader nation or clan divisions idea. Aboriginal people who had migrated from mainland Australia became cut off from their cousins on the mainland. Archaeological evidence suggests remnant populations on the King and Furneaux Highlands being stranded by rising waters, later to die out. These are the very people who could provide DNA evidence of early humans in this part of the world. Since these humans would have been traveling as recently as 40,000 years ago, they would provide a source of DNA evidence to shed light on this quandary.
Couldn't there already be humans on Tasmania during its journey with Australia on the breakup of Pangea?
Scientists say no.
Could the Indians of the Mahabharata share DNA with Australians that crossed over to Tasmania on that last bridge from Pangea?
Scientists say no.
Did these migrants have landing papers 4,000 years ago? Or was it 400,000 years ago when they hitched a ride from India?
Scientists say no.
The Aboriginal Tasmanians, the Palawa people. It was believed that prior to the first Europeans, that there were a great number more Tasmanians at the time. When Francisco de Orellana first sailed the Amazon, he described a population numbering in the millions along the river. Only 2 years later, there were less than 10% of the population left. Before British colonization of Tasmania in 1803, there were an estimated 3,000 to 15,000 Palawa. The Palawa population suffered a drastic drop in numbers within 3 decades, so that by 1835 only 400 full-blooded Tasmanian Aboriginal people survived, most being incarcerated in camps where all but 47 died within the following 12 years. Between 1803 and 1823, there were 2 phases of conflict. The first took place between 1803 and 1808 over the need for common food sources such as oysters and kangaroos. The second between 1808 and 1823, when only a scarce number of white females resided among the colonists, farmers, sealers, and whalers. They all took part in the abduction and trading of Aboriginal women into slavery. These practices also increased conflict over women among Aboriginal tribes. This in turn led to a decline in the Aboriginal population. Historian Lyndall Ryan records 74 Aboriginal people, almost all women, living with sealers on the Bass Strait Islands in the period up to 1835. By 1816, kidnapping of Aboriginal children for labor became widespread. In 1814, Governor Thomas Davey issued a proclamation expressing utter indignation and abhorrence in regards to the kidnapping of the children, and in 1819 Governor William Sorrell reissued the proclamation. The Black War of 1828-32 and the Black Line of 1830 were turning points in the relationship with European settlers. Even though many of the Aboriginal people managed to avoid capture during these events, they were shaken by the size of the campaigns against them, and this brought them to a position whereby they were willing to surrender to Robinson and move to Flinders Island. Resettlement of the Aboriginal population. In 1831, George Augustus Robinson brought the first 51 Aboriginals to a settlement on Flinders Island named the Lagoons, which turned out to be inadequate as it was exposed to gales, had little water and no land suitable for cultivation. Supplies to the settlement were inadequate, and within months 31 Aboriginal people had died. Lieutenant Governor George Arthur persuaded the 200 surviving Aboriginal Tasmanians to surrender themselves with assurances that they would be protected, be provided for, and eventually have their lands returned to them. Is that your final answer, Lieutenant Governor George Arthur? These assurances were false. There is no suggestion that Robinson or Lieutenant Governor Arthur intended anything other than exile everyone to the Furneaux Islands. The assurances were given by Robinson in order to facilitate the removal of the Aboriginal people from mainland Tasmania. The survivors were moved to Waibelena Aboriginal establishment on Flinders Island, where diseases continued to reduce their numbers even further. In 1847, the last 47 living inhabitants of Waibelena were transferred to Oyster Cove, south of Hobart. 2 individuals, Truganini, 1812 to 1876, and Fanny Cochrane Smith, 1834 to 1905, are separately considered to have been the last people solely of Tasmanian descent. So ends at least 40,000 years of evolution, if not 250,000.
The traditional view, still affirmed, held that this demographic collapse was the result of diseases, rather than the consequence of policy.
Reporters say no.
In 1831, Robinson brought Aboriginals to a new well-suited settlement camp on Flinders Island named the Lagoon.
Reporters say no.
Lieutenant Governor George Arthur gave his assurances that they would be protected and followed through.
Reporters say no.
Abel Jansen Tasman, credited as the first European to discover Tasmania in 1642, and who named it Van Diemen's Land, did not encounter any of the Aboriginal Tasmanians when he landed. In 1772, a French exploratory expedition under Marion Dufresne visited Tasmania. At first, contact with the Aboriginal people was friendly. However, the Aboriginal Tasmanians became alarmed when another boat was dispatched towards the shore. It was reported that spears and stones were thrown, and the French responded with musket fire, killing at least 1 Aboriginal person, and wounding several others. 2 years later, a French expedition led by Bruni d'Entrecasteaux in 1792-93 and Nicolas Baudin in 1802 made friendly contact with the Aboriginal Tasmanians, the d'Entrecasteaux expedition doing so over an extended period of time. The Resolution under Captain Tobias Furneaux expedition led by Captain James Cook visited in 1773. Gifts were left for them in unoccupied shelters found on Bruny Island. The first known British contact with the Aboriginal Tasmanians was on Bruny Island by Captain Cook in 1777. Contact was peaceful. Captain William Bligh also visited Bruny Island in 1788 and made peaceful contact with the Aboriginal Tasmanians. Contact with sealers and the formation of the Bass Strait community played a negative role. British and American seal hunters began visiting the islands in Bass Strait as well as the northern and eastern coasts of Tasmania from the late 1790s.
Each country, as they came to Tasmania, from the Dutch to the French to the British to the sealers, comprising of British and American seamen, contributed to the decline of an entire race of people.
There is plenty of information on the internet that will describe in great detail the horrific life of the Tasmanian Aboriginals since the day Europeans discovered them.
This document shall delve no further into those details and focus instead on the opportunities to improve our knowledge and understanding of their journey from the beginning of time. The Palawa Nations.
Estimates made of the combined population of Aboriginal people of Tasmania, before European arrival in Tasmania, are in the range of 3,000 to 15,000 people, but genetic studies have suggested much higher figures, which is supported by oral traditions that Aboriginal people were more numerous than the white people were aware of, but that their population had been greatly reduced by a sudden outbreak of disease before 1803. This disease could have been spread by the Dutch more than 100 years ago. One Dutch sailor with the 1700s version of COVID is all it would have taken. Aboriginal Tasmanians had at least two hierarchies, the domestic unit or family group and the social unit or clan, which had a self-defining name with 40 to 50 people. They were primarily nomadic people who lived in adjoining territories, moving based on seasonal changes in food supplies such as seafood, land mammals, and native vegetables and berries. They socialized, intermarried, and fought wars against other clans. According to Ryan, the population of Tasmania was aligned into 9 nations composed of 6 to 15 clans each, with each clan comprising 2 to 6 extended family units who were relations. Individual clans ranged over a defined nation boundary with elaborate rites of entry required of visitors. There were more than 60 clans before European colonization, although only 48 have been located and associated with identified territories. Northeast Nation. The Northeast Nation consisted of 7 clans with around 500 members. They had good relations with the Ben Lomond Nation, whom they granted seasonal access to the resources of the northeast coast.
The Oyster Bay, the Perderum.
Largest Tasmanian nation with 10 clans totaling 700 to 800 people. The members of the Perderum Nation had good relations with the Big River Nation, with large congregations that favored hunting sites inland and at the coast. Relations with the North Midlands Nation were mostly hostile, and evidence suggests that the Douglas-Apsley region may have been a dangerous borderland rarely visited. The key determinant of campsites was topography. The majority of camps were along river valleys, adjacent north-facing hill slopes, and on gentle slopes bordering a forest or marsh. Big River Nation. The Big River Nation numbered 400 to 500 people consisting of 5 clans. Little is known of their seasonal movements, although it is believed that 4 of the 5 clans moved through Oyster Bay territory along the Derwent River to reach their coastal camps near Pittwater. The Oyster Bay people had reciprocal movement rights through Big River territory. The Northern Nation. The Northern Nation consisted of 4 clans with 200 to 300 people. Their country contained the most important ochre mines in Tasmania, accessed by well-defined roads kept open by firing. They traded the ochre with nearby clans people. They would spend part of the year in the country of the Northwest Nation to hunt seals and collect shells from Robbins Island for necklaces. In return, the Northwest Nation had free access to the ochre mines. Northwest Nation. The Northwest Nation numbered between 400 and 600 people at time of contact with Europeans and had at least 8 clans. They had good relations with the North Nation, who were allowed access to the resources of the Northwest Coast. Ben Lomond Nation. The Ben Lomond Nation consisted of at least 3 clans totaling 150 to 200 people. They occupied the 260 square kilometers of country surrounding the Ben Lomond Plateau. This clan was likely to have occupied the region of the modern-day Fingal Valley to the St. Mary's Plains and East Coast region. Planger Mariner is also used as a blanket term for all the members of the Ben Lomond Nation, which reflects the suffix mariner, recorded as meaning people or tribe. North Midlands Nation. The North Midlands Nation occupied the Midland Plains, a major geographical area formed in a horst and graben valley which was also subject to previous major freshwater lacustrine inundation. The result being a relatively flat and fertile landscape that supported a large biomass,
thus being a major food source for the Aboriginal peoples.
The North Midlands nation is likely to have consisted of several clans, but there are 3 accepted major clan divisions described in the ethnographic literature today.
What qualifies as an Aboriginal rock shelter? An Aboriginal rock shelter is a cave, overhang, or rock arch that contains evidence of use or occupation. Cultural material can be visible on the ground, such as artifacts, and archaeological rock markings or subsurface archaeological deposits can be present. Subsurface excavation can provide information on how Aboriginal people lived in the past. While some rock shelters may not contain any visible surface evidence of human occupation, they may contain accumulated sediment beyond the entrance, including buried archaeological material. Rock shelters were places of refuge from the weather, for short or long periods of habitation, and as places for performing ceremonies or making stone tools. Rock shelters may be found throughout Tasmania, usually in areas of limestone, dolerite, and sandstone. Limestone rock shelter sites in Tasmania's southwest are important to the Aboriginal community and are of particular interest to archaeologists due to the unique conditions in that region. Floor deposits within limestone rock shelters are often covered by a thin layer of limestone deposited during the natural erosion of the shelter roof and walls. When the rock shelter is unoccupied for a long period of time, this limestone deposit builds and hardens to form a cap that seals and protects the underlying floor from wind or water erosion. Kutikina Cave. The discovery of 19,000-year-old deposits at Kutikina, or Fraser, Cave demonstrated the Ice Age occupation of the highlands. Kutikina Cave is a rock shelter located on the Franklin River in the Southwest Wilderness, a World Heritage Area in Tasmania. Originally referred to as Fraser Cave, it was important in the establishment of the antiquity and range of Aboriginal occupation in Tasmania during the Pleistocene. Excavations were undertaken at the height of the protests over the proposed Franklin Dam construction.
The cave has important archaeological deposits relating to human occupation in the Pleistocene, with evidence of wallaby hunting at a time the landscape was open tundra.
Tasmania was the most southerly human occupation in the world during the last ice age. The archaeological evidence showed that this was one of the richest artifact deposits ever found. Over 250,000 fragments of bone and 75,000 stone artifacts were recovered from a relatively small excavation area comprising only 1% of the artifact-bearing deposit in the cave.
Noonamira Cave, Bluff Cave. Known as the Sleeping Place, is located in southwestern Tasmania. One of 3 caves east of Acheron Cave, with occupation levels of about 30,000 years ago, on rivers flowing to the southeast, in the Florentine Valley, at an altitude of 400 meters. It's a small limestone shelter in the wide, flat valley of the Florentine River, and is now surrounded by wet sclerophyll rainforest and scrub. It is 25 kilometers north of Bone Cave below the 1,400-meter high Mount Field Massif. It's a rich site, about 30,000 stone flakes and 200,000 bone pieces and high charcoal concentrations being recovered from 1 cubic meter of excavated sediment. Flood, 2004. The emu eggshell dates from 28,000 years ago and from between 16,000 and 13,000 years ago in the richest bone deposit. Late in the sequence, here and at Bone Cave, ringtail possums, Pseudochirus peregrinus, make their first appearance, suggesting that trees were returning after the passing of the glacial conditions. At Noonamira Cave they first appear in the deposit about 12,000 to 10,000 years ago. Thumbnail scrapers are first found in layers from between 24,000 to 21,000 years ago. Of the 5 pieces of Darwin glass found, the oldest is from 27,700 years ago. The site is 75 kilometers from Darwin Crater and would require a journey of about 100 kilometers. Warreen Cave. Warreen Cave in the Maxwell River Valley of the Southwest proved Aboriginal occupation from as early as 34,000 BP, making Aboriginal Tasmanians the southernmost population in the world during the Pleistocene era. This large cave is on top of a limestone outcrop at an altitude of about 200 meters above sea level above buttongrass and tea tree plains in the flat valley of the Maxwell River Valley. The oldest occupation level in this cave has been dated to about 35,000 years ago.
Human occupation of the site appears to have been slight between about 35,000 to 30,000 years ago and sporadic. Occupation becoming intense only between 24,000 and 22,000 years ago. The earliest Darwin glass appears at 24,000 years ago, and the earliest quartz thumbnail scrapers are at 20,000 years ago. Prior to the last glacial maximum, there is a greater accumulation of archaeological debris than after it, the site being abandoned about 16,000 years ago following the collapse of part of the cave. The floor of the cave is about 15 sqm, but the cave is believed to have been much larger before the collapse of the roof of much of it.
Parmerpar Meathainer Cave. This is a limestone cave in the valley of the north-flowing Forth River in the Central Highlands, east of Macintosh 91 Cave and Cradle Mountain, and northwest, or Warragara Shelter. Occupation at this site was continuous from about 34,000 to 780 years ago. The excavator has suggested that this gives the time when humans first arrived in Tasmania, indicating either there were time lags, in the order of 20,000 years between the colonization of northern and southeastern Australia, or that the northern Australian chronology was incorrect. This is the only known site in Tasmania where undisturbed occupation deposits continued throughout the Pleistocene and Holocene. Acheron Cave, Palewardia Wallana Lanala. This is a large limestone rock shelter, at an altitude of about 170 m, facing almost due west in the valley of the small Acheron River, about 9 kilometers from Maureen Cave and 15 kilometers from Kutikina Cave, Tasmania. The floor is about 40 sqm in area and about 140 centimeters deep. The cave was occupied between 30,000 and 13,000 years ago, after which it was abandoned. The findings had not been published at the time of writing. Tasmania is endless caves, caverns, and rock structures. Mole Creek caves underground rivers and glowworms of Maricopa Cave as well as sparkling crystals, reflective pools, stalactites, and stalagmites. Take time to listen to the music of underground creeks and soak up the silence of abandoned river passages. Maricopa Cave is a wet cave located at Mayberry, a few kilometers west of Mole Creek, on the route to Cradle Mountain. Maricopa Cave is highly decorated, including natural water features, and is also home to the fascinating Tasmanian cave spider. Guns Plains Cave's Bill Woodhouse was hunting possum in the area and the possum fell into a hole chased by his dogs. He retrieved the possum because there was a bounty on them, and so he discovered the cave. King Solomon's Caves is a small, dry cave located near Laina, 25 kilometers west of Mole Creek, on the route to Cradle Mountain. King Solomon's Cave is also home to the fascinating Tasmanian cave spider. Dunedin Cave is part of an extensive underground labyrinth that includes caves, sinkholes, swallets, and tunnels. Intrepid spelunkers have discovered the system stretches for over 40 kilometers under the forest around Medina in the Florentine Valley of Tasmania's southern center. Tasmanian Aboriginal cultural material or sites are defined as relics and therefore protected under the Aboriginal Heritage Act 1975. It is an offense to destroy, damage, deface, conceal, remove or otherwise interfere with a relic. It is also an offense not to report the finding of a relic. So if you suspect that an Aboriginal rock shelter has been discovered during your activity, do not interfere with the site. Report the site to Aboriginal Heritage Tasmania. Provide the location of the site and images on the Aboriginal Heritage Site reporting form and forward to aboriginal@heritage.tas.gov.au. Preserve Tasmanian Aboriginal cultural sites by reporting their presence to Aboriginal Heritage Tasmania. Tasmanian Aboriginal cultural material or sites are defined as relics and therefore protected under the Aboriginal Heritage Act 1975. It is an offense to destroy, damage, deface, conceal, remove or otherwise interfere with a relic. It is also an offense not to report the finding of a relic. So if you suspect that an Aboriginal rock shelter has been discovered during your activity, do not interfere with the site. Report the site to Aboriginal Heritage Tasmania. Provide the location of the site and images on the Aboriginal Heritage Site reporting form and forward to aboriginal@heritage.tas.gov.au. Preserve Tasmanian Aboriginal cultural sites by reporting their presence to Aboriginal Heritage Tasmania. Rock marking. Rock marking is the term used in Tasmania to describe the deliberate creation of marks or images on a rock surface by Aboriginal people in the past. There are over 60 recorded rock markings throughout Tasmania, which represent some of the oldest rock marking sites in the world.
Most Tasmanian rock markings are like rock art found on mainland Australia. However, their specific meaning and function have,
unfortunately, been lost to time. It is possible that rock markings were created for a range of meanings and functions, such as for ceremonial places or initiations. They may also have been used as a marker for boundaries between nations or language groups, to signal the availability of nearby resources, or to provide directions. There are two broadly recognized categories of rock markings in Tasmania: paintings and engravings. Many of Tasmania's engraving sites are located near the coast or a water source.
Painting sites are mostly found within rock shelters. Rock markings have been found on granite, limestone, and sandstone.
After centuries of weathering, some of these are not easy to see.
How were Aboriginal rock markings made? Engravings were made by pecking, abrading, hammering, or grinding away the surface of a rock to create a mark or image. Typically in Tasmania, engraved rock markings take the form of ovals, concentric circles, solid or dotted lines, cupules, and speckled clusters. There are also registered rock marking sites that depict bird tracks, hands, and human-like figures. Paintings are made by adding pigment to the surface of a rock. The paint used is derived from ground ochre, hematite or iron oxide, mixed with a variety of animal fat, water, blood, and/or saliva. Painted rock markings may be applied using a finger or brush, or by stenciling, that is to spray the paint from one's mouth over an object, usually a hand, to create a negative image. Pangea. Formerly known as Mount Cameron West, covers an area of 524 hectares and was declared an Indigenous Protected Area in 1999. Splendid Tasmanian Aboriginal cave etchings make it a unique destination. The Pangea artwork is the finest example of Tasmanian Aboriginal art, and one of the finest displays of hunter-slash-gatherer art in the world. Located 3 kilometers from Mount Cameron West, on the northern end of the beach, the art is perched just 20 centimeters above the high tide mark. Geometric motifs cover nearly every inch of rock, causing the pieces to resemble sculptured rock. Circles, trellises, rows of dots form intricate patterns, parts of composite designs occupied by crosses, parallel lines, and circles. These ancient pieces are believed to be more than 2,000 years old. What are Aboriginal stone artifacts? Stone artifacts are evidence of stone modified or used by Tasmanian Aboriginal people in the past. Aboriginal people quarried particular stone outcrops or collected stones from riverbeds and coastal zones to create a sophisticated set of tools. Chert, quartzite, silcrete, sphonolite, quartz, and other types of rock were used. Aboriginal stone artifacts were made by hitting a piece of modified stone, core, with a cobble held in the hand, hammerstone, to remove a stone fragment, flake. Both cores and flakes could be used as stone tools. Flakes could be further modified into specific tools such as scrapers or blades. Tasmanian Aboriginal people traded stone resources long distances and in the recent past, quickly adopted new materials such as glass to create tools. Features of Aboriginal stone artifacts. A flake stone artifact is usually produced by striking a piece of siliceous rock or mineral, core, with force at an angle using a hammerstone. The flake ventral surface was originally attached to the core, while the flake dorsal surface is the outer surface of the core. The ventral surface may show where the hammerstone struck or point of force application, PFA, a bulb of percussion that reflects the force traveling through the stone and fissures or ripple marks radiating out from the impact point. The dorsal surface may show cortex, weathering on the original surface of the core, negative flake scars showing previous flake removal and flake scar ridges. A flake could be immediately used to cut and scrape or may have been modified on the margins, retouched, as part of a process called reduction. Retouch function to resharpen the flake or create a particular scraping or cutting tool. Other artifacts may be hammerstones, grinding stones, or anvils showing depressions or pitting and river cobbles with a chopping edge.
Tiger design pipe. I want one.
This rare 200-year-old clay pipe depicting a Tasmanian tiger is reputed to be the holy grail of Tasmanian archaeology. Discovered in a bottle dump in Launceston, in Tasmania, buried amongst smashed bottles dated to around 1830, the old pipe is decorated with one of the earliest recorded European depictions of a Thylacynus cynocephalus. Created about 190 years ago from molded river clay, the pipe not only depicts a Tasmanian tiger but also a kookaburra which was not introduced to Tasmania until 1902. Clay pipes were the preferred nicotine delivery system used before cigarettes were mass-produced in the 19th century, and pipes were made with one-time use molds which were discarded after a pipe had been made. The pipe was excavated in 2016 by an amateur bottle digger who discovered it lodged between two larger bottles at the base of a rubbish pit on a private Launceston property. Aboriginal shell middens. Aboriginal shell middens are distinct concentrations of shell. They contain evidence of past Aboriginal hunting, gathering, and food processing. These middens consist primarily of concentrations of discarded shell and bone, botanical remains, ash and charcoal. Aboriginal midden material may appear on the ground surface as sparse scatters or concentrations of broken shell, and are often associated with dark, ashy soil including charcoal. Middens can also be visible in eroded or collapsed sections of dunes where they may appear as a dark, ashy band with layers of shell throughout. Midden sites can range in size from small shallow discrete scatters to extensive deposits that run along a coastline for hundreds of meters. The discarded shell and other materials may be the remains of a single meal, or the result of repeated use of a particular location over thousands of years. Significant site, Lake Leak. Previously Kearney's Bogs and Tombs Lake were described as resorts of the natives by settlers and showed substantial evidence of seasonal occupation. Furthermore, several small lagoons in the Midlands area all show substantial archaeological evidence of regular occupation consistent with toolmaking and semi-nomadic use. Aboriginal roads, Markener, are described as passing up the eastern tiers to Swanport, up the western tier to Interlaken and up the Lake River to Woods Lake and thence to the Central Highlands. Significant site, Cataract Gorge. Contemporary Palawa assert the significance of the Cataract Gorge as a place of ceremony and significance. Certainly, in 1847, when a surviving Aboriginal chief was temporarily returned to Launceston from exile in Waibalena, he requested to be taken to the Cataract Gorge and was described as being jubilant at return to the gorge, followed with apparent lamentation at what had been lost to him. There are no recorded significant archaeological remains in the gorge precinct, although the area was subject to significant seasonal flooding before damming. Significant site, Patterson's Plains. Specific meeting places at Patterson's Plains, near modern-day St. Leonard's, and groups as large as 150 had been recorded in colonial times in this vicinity. There are so many more to explore. Where did the dead go? Spirit of the dead traveled to a place over the sea to the far northwest, called Mueai. The island of the dead, Teeny Dryny, was described as an island in Bass Strait where the dead would jump up white men. Jump up white men refers to the Aboriginal skeleton of the reborn. As they would rise from the grave, they were now the white of their skeleton. Tribes differ on these customs sometimes. The dead might be cremated or put in a hollow tree or a rock grave. Different clans, different customs. The 10,000 years from leaving the mainland would have resulted in many different behaviors from their cousins. None of what is known about the mainland Aboriginals can be applied to the Tasmanian Aboriginals. Fathers kept the bones of ancestors for talismans and amulets. Bones could be worn on a kangaroo sinew or kept in a kangaroo skin bag. These traditions evolved separately, and even today these types of things are not known in the detail they deserve. A larger caste than you might be aware of. Manalarjena described talking to his devil as a personal spirituality that provided all-seeing powers. The prime badass was a dude named Rajarapper, a large black man associated with darkness, and born on a strong wind. The devil may a source of a severe illness, so by cutting the skin, the evil spirit is released. There are many spirits in the world. A creator spirit called Tigana Marabona is known as Twilight Man. Nama Burag is the ghost of the thunderstorm, and Ragi Roba the revered spirit. Laga Robana, the awful spirit of the dead, or Mayan Ginya the killer or bringer of death. Muran Bugana Lawana, or the bright spirit of the night. She was good for dreams because she was kind and friendly. Don't forget Bade Nala, the shadow man, and Kanatana the bone man. We set traps for them, waited out all night, and even had a bunch of other kids helping us trap them. Creation myths. Most cultures have a creation myth to explain how they arrived on Earth. In the case of the Palawa, this refers to two creator deities, Moini and Dromardine, the children of Parnuan, the sun, and Vina, the moon. Moini was the primeval creator, forming the land and rivers and making first men. Parlevar from a spirit residing in the ground. I think Parlevar was supposed to look like a kangaroo, so that's why you see kangaroo totems. Moini then created the kangaroo, who emerged, like the first men, from the soil.
Moine fought his brother Dromardine and many devils because Dromardine changed the shape of man.
Moine was hurled to death from the sky to take the form of a big stone at Coxbite,
just down on the southwest coast.
Dromardine fell at Louisa Bay.
Tugelo, or what's known as Port Davy, is just north of there and is where the devils live. The area has valleys and caves, inhabited by spiritual sprites. Some clans create animal spirits from trees to aid their way in the physical world. Devils walk alongside people carrying a torch, but remaining unseen.
The Pangea petroglyphs. 60 years after they were sawn from an ancient rock art gallery, the Pangea petroglyphs were returned to Tasmania's Aboriginal community and their original site in the northwest. Dating to between 4,000 and 14,000 years old, the Pangea is dotted with Aeolian sandstone, into which Tasmania's first inhabitants made carvings of great spiritual and ceremonial value, clusters of plate-sized circles and concentric rings, cross-hatched lines, stripes, dots and forms resembling human faces. More than 36 separate works of art were recorded in 1950. In 1962, museum staff used a crosscut saw to extract one of the more prominent rock carvings. Before the job was done, the slab had split in two. In a matter of hours, staff had inflicted more damage than 1,000 years of gale force winds. The physical return of the petroglyphs were being kept secret to guard against vandalism, or perhaps just anyone seeing them drop them. The logistics of moving such large, heavy, and yet extremely fragile objects would not be easy. We don't know the meaning that our old people gave to them, Rebecca Digney, the head of the Aboriginal Land Council of Tasmania, tells the Art newspaper. She says the imminent return of the petroglyphs is really about putting back a piece of that puzzle. TMAG were the real vandals, says the historian Peter Sims, who photographed the Pangea site prior to the petroglyphs removal. When he returned in late 1962, he found what he describes as an act of official vandalism that left him shocked. Brett Tarasai, the chair of the TMAG board, said the museum had exploited the remains of Aboriginal people as objects of research, created inappropriate displays, and promulgated false ideas of extinction. The removal of the Pangea petroglyphs by museum staff in the 1960s is a key example of such past practices, she said.